This is our 69th lesson. We'll finish chapter 16 tonight and start on chapter 17. That'll be our last chapter. Uh, and so we should finish the material before Christmas, for the end of the year this year. We're looking at the biblical flood, and I'm Marion Fox instructing. We're going to look at the optimum conditions for life, and we'll make some additional predictions about the flood model as well before we get into the optimum conditions. And I should have had this on the tail end of the last lesson, but I didn't. But look at our optimum conditions for life. And this will explain why men lived to be nearly 1,000 years old before the flood. They don't live that long now. We'll give a summary of the things we've developed in the study, and then we'll make some final remarks and some concluding remarks. We'll be through with chapter 16. When I look at this, here's some additional predictions I make. If my flood model is correct, there probably should be faulting on the crust of the planet Mercury if Mercury was the planet that caused the flood that God used. Because the action that caused faults to occur on the Earth would have caused faults to occur on the planet Mercury. And if it were the planet that caused the flood. In fact, I predicted this several years ago, about 20 years ago, that there would be fault lines on Mercury, and they found them. And this is a reference peg. And when you get the book, and I'll send it to you again. I keep adding stuff to it now. So I'll try to send it to you maybe tonight after the class is over. But this is a reference. And this side of Peg et al., Peg and this article and the other co-writers with him, they cite like 30 or 40 different sources for this. They have pictures of it from the probes that have gone around Mercury and photographed it. So they found it. I'll make one additional prediction, but I don't know how they're going to confirm or deny or disprove this prediction. I think there's also a strong likelihood that the core of Mercury also rotates at a different angular velocity than the mantle, just like the Earth does. And from the same principles, the same causal factors. And that it may be tilted on its axis as well. The magnetic field, and Mercury has a magnetic field. They didn't think it would, but they found it has a magnetic field. And the magnetic field probably is not aligned with the core. Probably not aligned with the mantle of the crust. Most of the crust of the Earth of Mercury has been lost, probably when it was bombarded by the materials from its rings as it interacted with the Earth and the Moon. There's probably also geologic evidence on Venus of the interaction with Mercury. But again, that'll be harder to see because we can't see down deep into Venus's surface, only with radar can they see it, because it's hot, dense, and it's shrouded by clouds of gas clouds. When Mercury was pulled away from the Earth, and the effect here, when Mercury was coming around, it made 3 passes before it finally was pulled away by the sun. I think Venus helped the sun to pull it away. And when this happened, the third time, I say that the moon was also circling the Earth, obviously, at this time. On the first 2 passes, the moon was probably in this region and Mercury was over here, helping to pull it back. But probably on the last pass, the moon was over here, further away, and its gravity wasn't helping very much. Probably that's the cycle of the moon, we got about 150 days in here. The moon would get about 2 revolutions for every one of these cycles of Mercury around the Earth. So I think it probably was in this location, and that would reduce its gravitational attraction. About 1,000,000 miles from the Earth, Mercury, the Earth and the sun's gravity are equal. Goes beyond 1,000,000 to be pulled away, and its rings were pulled back. We've already talked about that. Some of them were pulled back. There's also impact craters on Venus. They've confirmed this with radar and with high frequency radar pulses or signals that they've gone through the cloud cover, and it's shaped like a parabola, which is about what you'd expect if these rings come around and they hit Venus on the pass around it here. Now, it slowed it down, and NASA uses this to slow down and to speed up various objects. Some of their probes that they'll send around Venus, a time or two, and cycle back around the Earth, and then they'll whip them out into space. And of course, I'm convinced that Venus had, like the moon, it kept the same side to the sun before this all occurred. And then whenever it came up, when Mercury came around, there was a transfer of angular momentum, and it began to rotate retrograde backwards. Whereas Earth rotates this way, Venus rotates this way, backwards. And I think that transferred angular momentum, and the transfer of momentum slowed Mercury down and put it in the orbit, in the inner orbit. But Venus should have evidence of impact. It has evidence of impact. It's parabola shaped, and there's one area, and it's not over the whole planet. And it's just in one area, as if it grazed, passed by. And if it was sitting there in lockstep with the sun, it wouldn't have been rotating very far. This side would have had it. Now it's rotating backwards in a slower rate. It takes about 240 days or something like that for it to make one revolution. Pretty slow, backwards, retrograde. Mercury rotates about a 55 or 60 day rotation, which would be just about the 3 cycles around the Earth. But it would have rotated around the Earth in about 50 days. That's about what we see here. Right now, Venus should have something there, possibly, besides the impact craters that's in a parabola shape. Right? But there should be, let's go to optimum conditions for life on the Earth now. There should be an optimum barometric pressure amount of each gas, such as nitrogen, oxygen, and so forth, in the atmosphere, optimum humidity, optimum amount of nutrient in each soil, and amount of each wavelength of light. Now, farmers check the soil and they find that if it's deficient in some nutrient, they add that nutrient to it, and they get better growth out of their plants. We understand that. And so that's pretty well understood by people. So we understand about the nutrients in the soil, but we sometimes forget about, as we step forth the barometric pressure, we've already done this with hyperbaric chambers. We've shown that the amount of gas and the evidence is that there was about twice as the oxygen level. We have 29% oxygen now. The evidence was there was about 35% oxygen in the antediluvian atmosphere. It's 2.5, maybe 3 times the barometric pressure. And that gave us conditions where the heart rate would be much slower, respiration would be much slower, and it would just do a whole lot of, give a whole lot of benefits to us. And we've already been through those benefits. I won't go back and rehash them. But remember from the principles of biology, if a bacteria or some microorganism such as a bacteria or yeast, if it goes through the pasture point, that's the point at which it runs out of oxygen, and many of the biological organisms, yeast and bacteria and so forth, they will change from being aerobic, that is, they assimilate their nutrients by oxygen, and if they run out of oxygen, they will shift gears and begin to assimilate their nutrients by anaerobic conditions, no oxygen. They'll pull the oxygen out of the water, H2O, and then frequently they'll leave an alcohol. And there's different kinds of alcohol, in case you didn't know it. And so what we have here is these plants, bacteria and yeast and so forth, give off poisons, and these poisons would then change the health of the people. Before the flood, these things would not have gone through the Pasteur point. Pasteur, well, let's just call it Pasteur point, from Louis Pasteur. He discovered it. And they wouldn't go through it, probably because of the increased oxygen in the atmosphere and because of the barometric pressure. And so I don't believe that we would have fermentation of grape juice, and that's probably why Noah became drunken. He didn't know about it, and it was an accident. But what I'm saying is all of these things would have been the pre-flood antediluvian conditions. Even the amount of wavelength of each light, various colors of light or wavelengths of light. These optimum conditions would have been the antediluvian conditions because men lived to be nearly 1,000 years old. We see this from Genesis 5:27 and 9:29 and so forth. We'll look two passages quickly. But it's reasonable to believe that animals live that long. And we've explained the dinosaurs with this. If humans were living to be 1,000 years old and lizards live to be 1,000 years old, they'll get big because reptiles grow all their lives. They don't quit growing until they die. And if you take a horned toad like we have in Oklahoma, and I've seen horned toads probably 6 or 7 inches long, and you take one of them, let him live to be 500 years, he may be 20 feet long. And let him live 1,000 years, he may be 50 feet long. So they'll just keep growing. Whereas mammals, most mammals quit growing when they reach maturity. Elephants are an exception, they continue to grow. Let's look further. Genesis 5:27, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And I hear people make a fallacious statement that say, this is the oldest man that ever lived. That's not necessarily true. It's the oldest one recorded in the Bible. And it's possible he's the oldest man who ever lived, but he's recorded because he's in the lineage of Noah. And he's Noah's grandfather or great-grandfather, I've forgotten. But he's in the lineage of Noah. And of course, he's our great, a whole bunch of great-grandfather too. He's in our lineage. Let's take Noah now, Genesis 9:28. And 29, and Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So he lived 350 years before the flood, 300 years, 600 years before the flood, and 350 years after the flood. So that's a long time to live, almost 1,000 years. There are other men that live that long too. So what we run into is something was different about the conditions. And not even anywhere near that long. If a person lived to be 110 years old, they consider him ancient, very old. And that would have been just a boy to Methuselah. If these conditions could be discovered by scientific research, we can figure out these conditions, they would most likely have been the antediluvian conditions. And that's what we would expect from the flood model postulated by flood model in this treatise. We need to do additional research. Should be done on the trace element content of the quick frozen mammals or animals under near the polar regions. Why? Because if these animals were living before the flood and then they're frozen, you could take the elements, the minerals in their tissue, you could see what was the antediluvian conditions, what they were eating and what their conditions were. Trace element content would be near the optimum value of what is required to be healthy. And sometimes there's some trace elements, just very small portions of those elements, molybdenum, for instance, and elements like that, just small amounts of it are needed for health in the human body. If the flood model postulated by this author is correct, these animals should not show any evidence of malnutrition. And I have read about it, and I'm sorry I didn't jot it down, but I read that they did not show any evidence of malnutrition or sickness or illness. In addition, their tissues contain the trace elements, mineral contents that are near the optimum value for the health of an animal. Now, for the sake of growing livestock, various universities have researched what trace elements are needed to make animals healthy. And they will put these minerals and feed them to the animals, and the animals are able to be healthier and grow better. And so they have done a lot of research in this area, but this would tell them exactly what was needed, what trace elements and what amount of it needs to be in the tissue to be healthy. In addition, some areas were covered with the ice before the floodwaters reached them, places like northern Canada and probably up in Siberia, and of course Greenland. Now, if the soil underneath this were examined, the section of land under the ice sheet, such as Greenland, which has never flooded, the soil should be extremely fertile near optimum. That should be what we would optimize the soil, keep it and make it extremely fertile. Now, the absence of these trace minerals affect our health, and we'll be looking at that in the next 2 or 3 lessons. I argue that God created all living things to live in these optimum conditions. And he removed those conditions because sin against an evil work is not speedily executed into the hearts of the sons of men are fully set to do evil. I believe that's in the 8th chapter and 13th verse of Ecclesiastes. It is my contention God created all living things with genetic variations that enable them to adapt to the changes in the optimum conditions within certain limits. That would be microevolution, not macroevolution, adaptation, adapting to it. I believe the atheist has a tremendous problem explaining why living organisms evolved for these optimum conditions, but they supposedly never lived under them. Why did they evolve to these optimum conditions? But they never lived under them, according to the atheist. Organisms evolved for these optimum conditions, not for the conditions in which they evolved. Let's assume that macroevolution occurred. Let's assume the atheist is right. Then the question asks, well, why didn't they evolve for the conditions under which they evolved? Why didn't they adapt to those conditions and optimize them? For example, if man evolved in the last 10 million years, and the oxygen content of the atmosphere in the last 10 million years has been stable at about 12%, with an atmospheric pressure of about 14.7 pounds per square inch. It's called one atmosphere, or 101,325 pascals. That's metric measurement. Why is a greater oxygen content barometric pressure healthier for man? Why didn't they evolve to handle that lower barometric pressure, lower oxygen content? That's a good question. I don't believe the atheist can answer it. Surely natural selection, organic microevolution, would have selected those who are better able to survive in these lower conditions, would have selected them rather than us who would do much better in these optimum conditions. What I've set forth in the preceding 15 and even the 16th chapter here will answer many of the questions asked by the atheists. Look at the questions that we've answered that the atheists have asked. When I began this study of this book, I went to various websites and various books that were written by atheists, by either atheists, agnostics, or even old Earth creationists who argued that the flood was local. Even some of the atheists now are claiming, yeah, there was a flood, but it was a local flood. They're even admitting that, beginning to admit it. But those people have asked these questions. When I decided to do my study, I said, I have to answer as many of the arguments against the universal flood as I can get, that I can answer. That's why this treatise has been so lengthy and my study's been so long. Why are there earthquakes? Why are there floods? Why are there storms? And why is other destructive physical phenomena? Did these occur before the flood? I don't believe they did. And so what we're saying is, why did they happen? Why are there volcanoes? Were there volcanoes before the flood? The Bible doesn't mention volcanoes before the flood, doesn't mention earthquakes before the flood, doesn't mention storms before the flood. And it tells us there was no rain before the flood. But why are there volcanoes? Our flood model explains why volcanoes occur. Why are there polar ice caps? How did they get here? The atheist model won't work because when it gets real cold, remember, the amount of humidity in the air goes down to almost nil, almost zero. The air gets extremely dry, and it can't, if the air's dry, it can't snow. And so the reason for the polar ice caps in these extremely cold regions, it just won't work. One of the driest places on earth is Antarctica. Very dry. Why people of the Old Testament times could marry their close relatives. I wouldn't think of marrying even a cousin, a second cousin. I would not even think of doing that. And there's good reasons for it, mutations. Why could they marry close relatives and we can't? And apparently had no problems from it. How did marine life, that sea life fossils, how did they get to the interior continents? Right? How did the quick frozen animals near the polar region, how were they trapped in the ice and frozen so quickly? That ice had to be extremely cold to freeze those big animals. Remember, the interior organs will begin to decay pretty quickly after the animal dies. But the animals, the huge elephants, mammoths, are frozen so quickly that the internal organs are still intact. The figurative expressions found in the deep wonders of heaven, what do they mean? We're interpreting the Bible. How were mountains built? Called orogenesis. Oros is the Greek word for mountain, and Genesis is the beginning of something. How did they get built? Remember, the atheists admit they cannot explain orogenesis. They have not come up with a way to figure out how mountains could be elevated up. What would push them up or raise them up? And my model has them being raised up by the gravity of the planet, in this case, the planet Mercury. The reason for a rise in the levels of the oceans, they admit the oceans have risen. We have archaeological evidence that humans lived in places that are now 250, 300 feet below the level of the oceans on the continental shelves. They found archaeological evidence that people lived there. And the oceans have risen close to 300 feet or more. People were living on those coasts, and now it's over 300 feet deep. The water is in those places. So my model explains how that has risen. The levels of the oceans have risen. Why we have the changes in climate in such areas of the world as Palestine. At one time, it was a land flowing with milk and honey. Why is it different now? My model explains it. How are submarine canyons cut? There's no method to cut them other than rivers. And of course, if we had a tidal flood, it would explain the canyons cut into the continental shelves. The absence of marine sedimentary rock in some areas near the North Pole. There's no marine sedimentary rock there. Why is it not there? My model will explain it. Some other flood models won't explain that. How did we have the longevity of antediluvian mankind, pre-flood mankind? Now, why did they live so long? How did antediluvian plants and animals get so large? If they're reptiles and they live to be 1,000 years old, a little horned toad can be quite a big animal. He can be about 40 or 50 feet long by the time he gets to be 800 or 1,000 years old. The exponential drop in the longevity of post-diluvian mankind. And we went through this, and it follows a decaying exponential base A logarithmic curve. It's exponential curve. And it follows it to over a 9% probability if you project with the ages of the death, the longevity of the mankind after the flood, starting with Shem and trace his descendants. Ones we know when they died and how long they lived. A sudden drop in the longevity of post-diluvian mankind right after the flood. Noah lived 950, and Shem only lived 600, his son. Why was that sudden drop? Shem was born before the flood, but Noah lived most of his life before the flood. How did soot and charcoal and kerosene, which are products from burning, get deposited in some of the sedimentary layers? And again, many of the flood models don't explain that, but mine does. Why does the Earth's core rotate faster than the rest of the Earth? Well, that would fit in quite well if we had an interaction of two planets, Earth and Mercury, and probably some interaction there with our moon at the same time. Our moon is so big, it's almost considered a binary planet. Earth and moon is a binary, two planets in binary form. Why the magnetic and geographic poles of the Earth are not aligned? My model explains it. As a sidelight, this position may explain why ancient people worship the planetary bodies, thought they had effects on the lives of people, my astrology, how it came about. It may also explain demon worship, because the word for demon in the Greek, and I believe the Hebrew probably would carry the same thrust, is the spirit of a person who's died. That's what a demon was. And if that's true, if some of these men were living to be 500 years old, and then their descendants, their great grandchildren are still alive when they're alive, they begin to look at their great 4, 5, or 6 greats grandfather as almost a godlike person, and they have abilities. Probably they could think clearly. They were healthy, and they had a brilliant mind, probably. And all of these things, they could almost rule like kings. They probably were kings, ruled over their descendants. So the practice of consulting the stars is condemned in the Bible, of course. We know that to be the case, and I won't look at those passages. And what about megalithic architecture, such as the pyramids of Egypt? These great pyramids. Some estimates are it took a couple of 100 years to build some of these pyramids. Well, if a man was living to be 400 years old, he could easily have done it. And they had brains that were smart. They were very intelligent. They weren't cavemen like we think, dumb clods. They were probably very intelligent. Maybe had IQs of 180, 190, maybe even up around 200. Brilliant men, probably. They could figure these things out and could build these things. These may be almost what we're seeing with the Tower of Babel. When they scattered, they may have tried to build these like the Tower of Babel. That may be. We have bigger pyramids in Mexico and Central America than we do in Egypt. Did you know that? They're actually larger. step pyramids in Mexico. I've climbed up them. I've been up some of them. I think that it took a couple hundred years to build them. I believe I'm convinced probably some post-Diluvian king after the flood king, did be 400 years or somewhere thereabouts, back in the time of Eber or Peleg in Genesis 11:14-19, could have completed them. And of course, there were other descendants. These are just the descendants of Shem, could be descendants of Ham and Japheth that were building them as well. Some may reply, well, you delved into areas where the scriptures are silent. That's true, I admit it. But we started out to use scientific evidence to derive it from proper conclusions. Remember, we began our study, we said we'll start with the Bible and we won't take any claims that are contrary to the Bible. I agree that's true to some extent. But we have arrived at a correlation of the Holy Writ of the Scriptures and the laws and facts of nature. We start with the facts, and we went to laws, and then we took very little credence to theories. So we based it more upon fact that we see. There are mountains out there, and there are fossils in the tops of the mountains and so forth. And my model explains all of those. Many of these same people who object to the position set forth by this author also presume on the silence of the scriptures too. They turn around and claim that the rain was caused by a miracle. Some Bible believers do. The Bible doesn't explicitly say whether or not the flood was caused by a miracle or by providence. We've already reasoned that miracles are not the norm. Providence is the norm. So it would fit much better in the realm of providence. God normally works through his natural laws to accomplish his desired ends, and miracles are the exception rather than the general rule. That's what we find in the Bible. Atheists frequently chide theists. Theists believe in God. Atheist says, I don't believe in God. But claims that the atheistic model has been proven by science. I hear that over and over, but it hasn't. I've repeatedly demonstrated that the atheistic models are flawed and cannot explain many phenomena. And I've explained also that true science is something that's empirical. It's based upon what you can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. Here's your five senses. You're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And then we can subdivide some of those into other ones, different senses of taste and touch and so forth. But let's just use five senses. Science is empirical. It's based upon what we can experience with our one or more of our five senses. And you can't go back and experience something that happened 1 million years ago or 100 million years ago. So that's not science. It's not true science if science is empirical. That's the problem. True science was based on empirical evidence, cannot explain most of what we've set forth in this volume because scientists have not observed the things occurring. It's not science. It's their theories and their projections, their extrapolation. Most of the theories about these things are based on uniformitarian assumptions. They extrapolate a present process backwards. But we've already seen that the geologists have rejected uniformitarianism. The flood model, they've already rejected, but they turn around and use it for their models to explain. Flood model postulated by this author provides a more reasonable explanation of the facts of nature than any of the atheistic models. I admit that my flood model might have flaws that are revealed by further evidence that's unearthed. Evidence from either the scriptures that I've failed to consider something or misinterpreted the scriptures, or from science. The following line of reasoning has been followed by me, by Marion Fox. First premise, if the atheistic model is true, then the atheistic model will explain every phenomenon. If it's true. Completely true. That's a fact. The atheistic model does not explain every phenomenon. Conclusion, the atheistic model is not true. That's my argument. Now, before we go too far, the reader, you should remember that this doesn't mean that all atheistic models have been disproven. I've only disproven the one that we have tested by this test. There may be other models that haven't been thought about that will explain this. Logically, that is a possibility. The atheist needs to modify his particular model and try again with a new model. That's good science. And I offer the following argument to support the basic thesis of my treatise. If Fox's theistic model explains more facts than the atheistic model, then Fox's theistic model is more reasonable. My model, Fox's theistic model, explains more facts than the atheistic model. Therefore, my model is more reasonable than any of the atheistic models that are out there that I've seen. It's more reasonable. I have given sound reason to question the truthfulness of several necessary conditions for atheism to be true. We've given good reasons. Long periods of time are required for atheism to be true. It has to have millions or billions of years. Atheism does. We've shown reasons to question that, good reasons to question it. Organic macroevolution is required for atheism to be true, and yet there's no evidence whatsoever to support it. None whatsoever. And besides all that, it's not science anyhow, because they're not seeing it occur. Not empirical. The eternality of matter is required, or either that or matter had to create itself. It either created itself or it's eternal. And neither one of those. It's absurd for something to create itself. And it's the eternality of matter violates some fundamental principles of physics. Also, the extrapolation of present process based on uniformitarian assumptions, which they've already rejected. They've already pointed this out repeatedly. They rejected uniformitarianism, and yet they still use it to do their calculations and do their projections. Long periods of time, organic macroevolution, uniformitarian processes, and eternality of matter are all necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient to prove it. Even if those were true, it still wouldn't prove that their model is true, that atheism is true. So it's not sufficient. I've attempted to develop a flood model that's harmony with both the scriptures, principles of science, and the facts of nature. I believe that's what I've done. It's possible that new information from one or more of these sources, these three sources I just listed, will necessitate the modification of this flood model. But I believe it can be modified. I'm indebted to a number of other men who blazed the trail, and I'll list some books. For instance, I believe Whitcomb and Morris's The Genesis Flood. I believe it's an excellent book. I think it has some things that it needs to be updated on, and I don't think it explains all the information, but it gives a lot of good information. It's a good book to have, and I would recommend you purchase it. I believe there are other books that we've listed that are very good, and I think the Biblical Flood and Ice Epic by Patton is an excellent book, if you can find it. And of course, hopefully you'll think my book is useful. But these men have blazed the trail, and I've learned much from these men. And you can go to the references for additional study at the end of this treatise and find it. The Genesis flood brought worldwide destruction on all forms of life. It did more to shape the surface of the earth than any other event since the creation. And I don't believe Christians need to fear the true science. It's not our enemy. True science deals with the facts that are derived by empirical means, by observation. And honest scientists distinguish between facts and theories. And they're willing to have their theories tested by empirical information to see if they're valid. The Lord revealed that the flood occurred and it was worldwide in scope. And that's our lesson for today. We had a worldwide flood and it accomplished all of these things that we've set forth.